Good afternoon, boys and girls in Neverland, wherever you are. I don't know if anybody is tuning in today. I don't have my own YouTube open to see, so we're just going to play it all by chance. Hopefully, the music level is pleasant today. We're going to be beginning Chapter 4 of the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket by Edgar Allan Poe. I'm going to pour myself a nice warm drink while we wait for people to come on in the door, get settled if they'd like to join us today. There's my thermos. Waldo had it, and he keeps disappearing. It's the strangest thing. Hey, Richie. Hi, Terry. It is a pretty cool effect that the tennis ball keeps coming in and out of existence, with he being my replacement for Wilson. You know, my name was Wilson when I was married. It's not now, but it's another fun connection on my own that made me go, what? We live in a movie. We live in a movie. Front row seats is right. And she is, by the way, that's the name of Martin Ledke's lady friend and her channel. If none of you are subscribed, she's very cool. Get a little magically cold cream. Taylor. We'll stir it up where you can hear it. Ooh. Get a good tinkle. Good afternoon. Yeah, also in Dennis the Menace. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson. But dude seriously was more like Dennis, just in a bigger body. And apparently with access to substances that made him even faster. Just an unstoppable pace. And there we go. That's ready enough. What other? There were some other Wilson connections for me too. You know, but I'm past sorting those ones. It's that Tom Hanks character again. Gosh. He's just everywhere. And I didn't like his voice narrations in, you know, he did the Polar Express. I think we talked about that one day. They could have picked someone with more range, but they gave it to the most popular dude, who happens to be Mr. CERN Portal or whatever. So it's 1:34. Why don't I find one last thing, which would be a lighter? Grandmother Spider doesn't have one up there. Snoop to the rescue! Chapter 4. The brig put out to sea, as I supposed, in about an hour after he had left the watch. This was on the 20th of June. It will be remembered that I had then been in the hold for 3 days, and during this period there was no constant bustle on board, and so much running to and fro, especially in the cabin and staterooms, that he had had no chance of visiting me without the risk of having the secret of the trap discovered. I need something to hold my line while I read. One more moment. When at length he did come, I had assured him that I was doing as well as possible, and therefore, for the next 2 days, he felt but little uneasiness on my account. Still, however, watching an opportunity of going down. It was not until the 4th day that he had one. Several times during this interval, he had made up his mind to let his father know of the adventure and have me come up at once, but we were still within reaching distance of Nantucket, and it was doubtful, from some expressions which had escaped Captain Barnard, whether he would not immediately put back if he discovered me to be on board. Besides, upon thinking the matter over, Augustus, so he told me, could not imagine that I was in immediate want, or that I would hesitate, in such case, to make myself heard at the trap. When, therefore, he considered everything, he concluded to let me stay until he could meet up with an opportunity of visiting me unobserved. This, as I said before, did not occur until the 4th day after his bringing me the watch, and the 7th since I had first entered the hold. He then went down without taking with him any water or provisions, intending in the first place merely to call at my attention and get me to come from the box to the trap. When he would go up to this purpose, he found that I was asleep, for it seems that I was snoring, to the stateroom, and thence hand me down a supply. That was strangely worded. I don't quite understand it. When he descended very loudly. From all the calculations I can make on the subject, this must have been the slumber into which I fell just after my return from the trap with the watch, and which, consequently, must have lasted for more than 3 entire days and nights at the very least. Okay, now I get it. Latterly, I have had reason both from my own experience and the assurance of others to be acquainted with the strong soporific effects of the stench arising from old fish oil when closely confined, and when I think of the condition of the hold in which I was imprisoned, and the long period with which the brig had been used as a whaling vessel, I am more inclined to wonder that I awoke at all, after once falling asleep, than that I should have slept uninterruptedly for the period specified above. He was perhaps not the great editor when he wrote this book that he later became. Augustus called to me first in a low voice and without closing the trap, but I made him no reply. He then shut the trap and spoke to me in a louder and finally in a very loud tone. Still I continued to snore. He was now at a loss what to do. It would take him some time to make his way through the lumber to my box, and in the meanwhile his absence would be noticed by Captain Barnard, who had occasion for his services every minute in arranging and copying papers connected with the business of the voyage. He determined, therefore, upon reflection, to ascend and await another opportunity of visiting me. He was the more easily induced to this resolve, as my slumber appeared to be out of the most tranquil nature, and he could not suppose that I had undergone any inconvenience from my incarceration. He had just made up his mind on these points when his attention was arrested by an unusual bustle, the sound of which proceeded apparently from the cabin. He sprang through the trap as quickly as possible, closed it, and threw open the door of his stateroom. No sooner had he put his foot over the threshold than a pistol flashed in his face, and he was knocked down at the same moment by a blow from a handspike. How exciting. Let's get a good sip. A strong hand held him on the cabin floor with a tight grasp upon his throat. Still, he was able to see what was going on around him. His father was tied hand and foot, and lying along the steps of the companionway with his head down and a deep wound in the forehead, from which the blood was flowing in a continued stream. He spoke not a word and was apparently dying. Over him stood the first mate, eyeing him with an expression of fiendish derision, and deliberately searching his pockets, from which he presently drew forth a large wallet and a chronometer. 7 of the crew, among whom was the cook, a Negro, were rummaging in the staterooms on the larboard for arms, where they soon equipped themselves with muskets and ammunition. Besides Augustus and Captain Barnard, there were 9 men altogether in the cabin, and these among the most ruffianly of the brig's company. The villains now went upon the deck, taking my friend with them, after having secured his arms behind his back. They proceeded straight to the forecastle, which was fastened down, 2 of the mutineers standing by it with axes, 2 also at the main hatch. The mate called out in a loud voice, I have an opportunity to do a voice. Do you hear there below? Tumble up with you one by one now. Mark that, and no grumbling. It was some minutes before any one appeared. At last an Englishman, who had shipped as a raw hand, came up, weeping piteously, and entreating the mate in the most humble manner to spare his life. The only reply was a blow on the forehead from an axe. That was the only prop I had time to make today on the fly. It's my brilliant disguise. Fucking fun. Okay. The poor fellow fell to the deck without a groan, and the black cook lifted him up in his arms as he would a child and tossed him deliberately into the sea. Hearing the blow and the plunge of the body, the men below could now be induced to venture on deck neither by threats nor promises until a proposition was made to smoke them out. A general rush then ensued, and for a moment it seemed possible that the brig might be retaken. The mutineers, however, succeeded at last in closing the forecastle effectually before more than 6 of their opponents could get up. These 6, finding themselves so greatly outnumbered and without arms, submitted after a brief struggle. The mate gave them fair words, no doubt with a view of inducing those below to yield, for they had no difficulty in hearing all that was said on deck. The result proved his sagacity, no less than his diabolical villainy. All in the forecastle presently signified their intention of submitting, and descending one by one, were pinioned and then thrown on their backs, together with the first 6 there being, in all of the crew who were not concerned in the mutiny, 27. That's always an important number in the pattern. Just saying, for those of you that watch. A scene of the most horrible butchery ensued. The bound seamen were dragged to the gangway. Here the cook stood with an axe, striking each victim on the head as he was forced over the side of the vessel by the other mutineers. In this manner 22 perished, and Augustus had given himself up for lost, expecting every moment his own turn to come next. But it seemed that the villains were now either weary or in some measure disgusted with their bloody labor, for the 4 remaining prisoners, together with my friend, who had been thrown back on the deck with the rest, were respited while the mate sent below for rum, and the whole murderous party held a drunken carouse, which lasted until sunset. Just for the record, JP, Jen Kent, I'm actually more like Jennifer, what's her name? The She-Hulk. My alter ego is named Harvey, and she is a cross between Hulk and Barbie. Watch out. They now fell to disputing in regard to the fate of the survivors, who lay not more than 4 paces off and could distinguish every word said. Upon some of the mutineers, the liquor appeared to have a softening effect, for several voices were heard in favor of releasing the captives altogether, on condition of joining the mutiny and sharing the profits. The black cook, however, who in all respects was a perfect demon and who seemed to exert as much influence, if not more, than the mate himself, would listen to no proposition of the kind, and rose repeatedly for the purpose of resuming his work at the gangway. Fortunately, he was so far overcome by intoxication as to be easily restrained by the less bloodthirsty of the party, among whom was a line manager who went by the name of Dirk Peters. This man was the son of an Indian woman of the tribe of Upsarokas, I don't know if I'm butchering that word, pardon moi, who live among the fastness of the Black Hills near the source of the Missouri. His father was a fur trader, I believe, or at least connected in some manner with the Indian trading posts on Lewis River. Peters himself was one of the most ferocious-looking men I had ever beheld. He was short in stature, not more than 4 feet 8 inches high, but his limbs were of Herculean mold. His hands especially were so enormously thick and broad as hardly to retain a human shape. His arms as well as legs were bowed at the most singular manner, and appeared to possess no flexibility whatever. His head was equally deformed, being of immense size, with an indentation on the crown, like that on the head of most Negroes, and entirely bald. To conceal this latter deficiency, which did not proceed from old age, he usually wore a wig formed of any hair-like material which presented itself, occasionally the skin of a Spanish dog or American grizzly bear. At the same time he had on a portion of one of these bear skins, and it added no little to the natural ferocity of his countenance, which betook of the Upsaroka character. The mouth extended nearly from ear to ear, the lips were thin, and seemed, like some other portions of his frame, to be devoid of natural pliancy, so that the ruling expression never varied under the influence of any emotion whatever. This ruling expression may be conceived when it is considered that the teeth were exceedingly long and protruding, and never even partially covered in any instance by the lips. To pass this man with a casual glance, one might imagine him to be convulsed with laughter, but a second look would induce a shuddering acknowledgment that if such an expression were indicative of merriment, the merriment must be that of a demon. Of this singular being, many anecdotes were prevalent among the seafaring men of Nantucket. These anecdotes went to prove his prodigious strength when under excitement, and some of them had given rise to a doubt of his sanity. But on board the Grampus, it seems, he was regarded, at the time of the mutiny, with feelings more of derision than of anything else. I have been thus particular in speaking of Dirk Peters, because, ferocious as he appeared, he proved the main instrument in preserving the life of Augustus, and because I shall have frequent occasion to mention him hereafter, in the course of my narrative. A narrative, let me be sure to say, which in its later portions will be found to include incidents of a nature so entirely out of the range of human experience, and for this reason so far beyond the limits of human credulity, that I proceed in utter hopelessness of obtaining credence for all that I shall tell, yet confidently trusting in time and progressing science to verify some of the most important and most improbable of my statements. I'm going to pause for just a moment, even though I've only been reading for a few minutes. I need another sip. And I'll share what I discovered about the name Pym. In addition to the connection to the Marvel Universe, I couldn't find a lot, except that after his death, and we all know how, the family of Robin Williams began a company that the abbreviation for is PYM, and they use it to stand for Prepare Your Mind, which I think is timely. It is a bunch of supplements and happy pills, basically. I don't know. I didn't read into it too deeply. The connection was enough for me. I'm moving on. So, after much indecision, there was another thing too about the name meaning that someone had, but it was only on Urban Dictionary. In an etymology search, I didn't come up with much, but if I remember to, I'll share that bit from, I think it was Urban Dictionary that had some history on the name. I'll share it later. We're ready to continue. After much indecision and 2 or 3 violent quarrels, it was determined at last that all the prisoners, with the exception of Augustus, whom Peters insisted in a jocular manner upon keeping as his clerk, should be set adrift in one of the smallest whale boats. The mate went down into the cabin to see if Captain Barnard was still living, for it will be remembered he was left below when the mutineers came up. Presently the two made their appearance, the captain as pale as death, but somewhat recovered from the effects of his wound. He spoke to the men in a voice hardly articulate, entreated them not to send him adrift, but to return to their duty, and promising to land them wherever they chose, and to take no steps for bringing them to justice. He might as well have spoken to the winds. Excuse me. He might as well have spoken to the winds. Two of the ruffians seized him by the arms and hurled him over the brig's side into the boat, which had been lowered while the mate went below. The four men who were lying on the deck were then untied and ordered to follow, which they did without attempting any resistance, Augustus being still left in his painful position, although he struggled and prayed only for the poor satisfaction of being permitted to bid his father farewell. A handful of sea biscuits and a jug of water were now handed down, but neither mast, sail, oar, nor compass. The boat was towed astern for a few minutes, during which the mutineers held another consultation. It was then finally cut adrift. By this time night had come on. There was neither moon nor stars visible, and a short and ugly sea was running, although there was no great deal of wind. The boat was instantly out of sight, and little hope could be entertained for the unfortunate sufferers who were in it. This event happened, however, in latitude 35 by 30 north, longitude 61:20 west, and consequently at no very great distance from the Bermuda Islands. Augustus therefore endeavored to console himself with the idea that the boat might either succeed in reaching the land or come sufficiently near to be fallen in with by vessels off the coast. So there's a coordinate. Make note. I'm going to note that page. Allow me. Handy dandy note keepers. Allan, shit, now where to go? What just happened? I lost my place. No, I didn't. There it is. Oh, my goodness. I got worried for a minute there. Did I lose my place? French, no. Don't do that. All sail was now put upon the brig, and she continued her original course to the southwest, the mutineers being bent upon some piratical expedition in which, from all that could be understood, a ship was to be intercepted on her way from the Cape Verde Islands to Puerto Rico. No attention was paid to Augustus, who was untied and suffered to go about anywhere forward of the cabin companion way. Dirk Peters treated him with some degree of kindness, and on one occasion saved him from the brutality of the cook. His situation was still one of the most precarious, as the men were continuously intoxicated, and there was no relying upon their continued good humor or carelessness in regard to him. His anxiety on my account he represented, however, as the most distressing result of his condition, and indeed I had never reason to doubt the sincerity of his friendship. More than once he had resolved to acquaint the mutineers with the secret of my being on board, but was restrained from so doing, partly through recollection of the atrocities he had already beheld, and partly through a hope of being able soon to bring me relief. For the latter purpose he was constantly on the watch, but in spite of the most constant vigilance, 3 days elapsed after the boat was cut adrift before any chance occurred. At length, on the night of the third day, there came on a heavy blow from the eastward, and all hands were called up to take in sail. During the confusion which ensued, he made his way below unobserved and into the stateroom. What was his grief and horror in discovering that the latter had been rendered a place of deposit for a variety of sea stores and ship furniture, and that several fathoms of old chain cable, which had been stowed away beneath the companion ladder, had been dragged thence to make room for a chest, and were now lying immediately upon the trap. To remove it without discovery was impossible, and he returned on deck as quickly as he could. As he came up, the mate seized him by the throat and demanded what he had been doing in the cabin. was about flinging him over the larboard bulwark when his life was again preserved through the interference of Dirk Peters. Augustus was now put in handcuffs, of which there were several pairs on board, and his feet lashed together tightly. He was then taken into the steerage and thrown into a lower berth next to the forecastle bulkheads, with the assurance that he should never put his foot on deck again until the brig was no longer a brig. This was the expression of the cook, who threw him into the berth. It is hardly possible to say with what precise meaning was intended by the phrase. The whole affair, however, proved the ultimate means of my relief, as will presently appear. Hi, boy. Hi, JP. I almost spat my coffee there. I enjoyed having a reason to use my mask. Oh, and we're half an hour in, so now is the time for treasures. Well, there seems to be something buried on the beach. What could it be? It's a golden egg. And what should be inside but a nugget of happiness? The gifts keep on going. I'm out of actual moon rocks. But this is, however, the remnants of what they told me was real Pineapple Express. And that explains a lot about the last couple days. So we're going to get that ready. Take a little break if you need it. It'll be just a minute while I get this arranged. Take a little hit. Relax. I'm always nervous when I read out loud because then I stumble over my words sometimes. And I want to emote properly while I read. Sometimes I think I read robotically. Put that delicious treasure back down where it was. Just in case I need it later. For some minutes For some minutes after the cook had left the forecastle, Augustus abandoned himself to despair, never hoping to leave the berth alive. He now came to the resolution of acquainting the first of the men who should come down with my situation, thinking it better to let me take my chance with the mutineers than perish of thirst in the hold. For it had been 10 days since I was first imprisoned, and my jug of water was not a plentiful supply even for 4. As he was thinking on the subject, the idea came all at once into his head that it must be possible to communicate with me by ways of the main hold. In any other circumstance, the difficulty and hazard of the undertaking would have prevented him from attempting it, but now he had, at all events, little prospects of life, and consequently little to lose. He bent his whole mind, therefore, upon the task. His handcuffs were the first consideration. At first he saw no method of removing them, and feared that he should thus be baffled in the very outset, but upon closer scrutiny he discovered that the irons could be slipped off and on at pleasure, with very little effort or inconvenience, merely by squeezing his hands through them. This species of manacle being altogether ineffectual in confining young persons, in whom the smaller bones readily yield to pressure. He now untied his feet, and leaving the cord in such a manner that it could easily be readjusted in the event of any person's coming down, proceeded to examine the bulkhead where it joined the berth. The partition here was of soft pine board, an inch thick, and he saw that he should have little trouble in cutting his way through. A voice was now heard at the forecastle companionway, and he had just time to put his right hand into his handcuff, the left had not been removed, and to draw the rope in a slip knot around his ankle, when Dirk Peters came below, followed by Tiger, who immediately leaped into the berth and lay down. Excuse me. The dog had been brought on board by Augustus, who knew my attachment to the animal and thought it would give me pleasure to have him with me during the voyage. He went up to our house for him immediately after his first taking me into the hold, but did not think of mentioning the circumstance upon his bringing the watch. Since the mutiny, Augustus had not seen him before his appearance with Dirk Peters, and had given him up for lost, supposing him to have been thrown overboard by some of the malignant villains belonging to the mate's gang. It appeared afterward that he had crawled into a hole beneath a whaleboat, from which, not having room to turn round, he could not extricate himself. Peters at last let him out, and with a species of good feeling which my friend knew well to appreciate, had now brought him to him in the forecastle as a companion, leaving at the same time some salt junk and potatoes, with a can of water. He then went on deck, promising to come down with something more to eat on the next day. When he had gone, Augustus freed both my hands from the manacles and unfastened his feet. He then turned down the head of the mattress on which he had been lying, and with his penknife, for the ruffians had not thought it worth while to search him, commenced cutting vigorously across one of the partition planks as closely as possible to the floor of the berth. He chose to cut here because, if suddenly interrupted, he would be able to conceal what had been done by letting the head of the mattress fall into its proper position. For the remainder of the day, however, no disturbance occurred, and by night he had completely divided the plank. It should here be observed that none of the crew occupied the forecastle as a sleeping place, living all together in the cabin since the mutiny, drinking the wines and feasting on the sea stores of Captain Barnard, and giving no more heed than was absolutely necessary to the navigation of the brig. These circumstances proved fortunate both for myself and Augustus, for had matters been otherwise, he would have found it impossible to reach me. As it was, he proceeded with confidence in his design. It was near daybreak, however, before he completed the second division of the board, which was about a foot above the first cut, thus making an aperture quite large enough to admit his passage through with facility to the main orlop deck. Having got here, he made his way with but little trouble to the lower main hatch, although in so doing he had to scramble over tiers of oil casks piled nearly as high as the upper deck, there being barely room enough left for his body. Upon reaching the hatch, he found that Tiger had followed him below, squeezing between two rows of the casks. It was now too late, however, to attempt getting to me before dawn, as the chief difficulty lay in passing through the close stowage in the lower hold. He therefore resolved to return and wait till the next night. With this design, he proceeded to loosen the hatch so that he might have as little detention as possible when he should come again. No sooner had he loosened it than Tiger sprang eagerly to the small opening produced, snuffed for a moment, and then uttered a long whine, scratching at the same time, as if anxious to remove the covering with his paws. There could be no doubt from his behavior that he was aware of my being in the hold, and Augustus thought it possible that he would be able to get to me if he put him down. He now hit upon the expedient of sending the note, as it was especially desirable that I should make no attempt at forcing my way out, at least under existing circumstances, and there could be no certainty of his getting to me himself on the morrow as he intended. After events proved how fortunate it was that the idea occurred to him as it did, for, had it not been for the receipt of the note, I should undoubtedly have fallen upon some plan, however desperate, of alarming the crew, and both our lives would most probably have been sacrificed in consequence. Hello, forever love. stuff in my eye. Having concluded to write, the difficulty was now to procure the material for doing so. An old toothpick was soon made into a pen, and this by means of feeling altogether for the between decks were as dark as pitch. Paper enough was obtained from the back of a letter, a duplicate of the forged letter from Mr. Ross. This had been the original draft, but the handwriting not being sufficiently well imitated, Augustus had written another, thrusting the first, by good fortune, into his coat pocket, where it was now most opportunely discovered. Ink alone was thus wanting, and a substitute was immediately found for this by means of a slight incision with a penknife on the back of a finger just above the nail, a copious flow of blood ensuing as usual from wounds in that vicinity. The note was now written as well as it could be in the dark and under the circumstances. It briefly explained that a mutiny had taken place, that Captain Barnard was set adrift, and that I might expect immediate relief as far as provisions were concerned, but must not venture upon making any disturbance. It concluded with these words: "I have scrawled this with blood. Your life depends upon lying close." The slip of paper being tied upon the dog, he was now put down the hatchway, and Augustus made the best of his way back to the forecastle, where he found no reason to believe that any of the crew had been in his absence. Where he found no reason to believe that the crew had been in his absence. Okay. To conceal the hole in the partition, he drove his knife in just above it and hung up a pea jacket which he found in the berth. His handcuffs were then replaced, and also the rope around his ankles. These arrangements were scarcely completed when Dirk Peters came below, very drunk, but in excellent humor, and bringing with him my friend's allowance of provision for the day. This consisted of a dozen large Irish potatoes, roasted, and a pitcher of water. He sat for some time on a chest by the berth, and talked freely about the mate and the general concerns of the brig. His demeanor was exceedingly capricious and even grotesque. At one time, Augustus was much alarmed by his odd conduct. At last, however, he went on deck, muttering a promise to bring his prisoner a good dinner on the morrow. During the day, 2 of the crew, harpooners, came down, accompanied by the cook, all 3 in nearly the last stage of intoxication. Like Peters, they made no scruple of talking unreservedly about their plans. It appeared that they were much divided among themselves as to their ultimate course, agreeing in no point, except the attack on the ship from the Cape Verde Islands, with which they were in hourly expectation of meeting. As far as could be ascertained, the mutiny had not been brought about altogether for the sake of the booty, a private pique of the chief mates against Captain Barnard having been the main instigation. A grudge. There now seemed to be 2 principal factions among the crew, one headed by the mate, the other by the cook. The former party were for seizing the first suitable vessel which should present itself, and equipping it at some of the West India Islands for a practical cruise. The latter division, however, which was the strongest and included Dirk Peters among its partisans, were bent upon pursuing the course originally laid out for the brig into the South Pacific, there either to take whale or act otherwise as circumstances should suggest. The representations of Peters, who had frequently visited these regions, had great weight apparently with the mutineers, wavering as they were between half-engendered notions of profit and pleasure. He dwelt on the world of novelty and amusement to be found among the innumerable islands of the Pacific, on the perfect security and freedom from all restraint to be enjoyed, but more particularly on the deliciousness of the climate, on the abundant means of good living, and on the voluptuous beauty of the women. As yet, nothing had been absolutely determined upon, but the pictures of the hybrid line manager were taking strong hold upon the ardent imaginations of the seamen, and there was every probability that his intentions would be finally carried into effect. The three men went away in about an hour, and no one else entered the forecastle all day. Hi, Lord Razor. It's been a minute. Nice to see you. Augustus lay quiet until nearly night. He then freed himself from the rope and irons and prepared for his attempt. A bottle was found in one of the berths, and this he filled with water from the pitcher left by Peters, storing his pockets at the same time with cold potatoes. To his great joy, he also came across a lantern with a small piece of tallow candle in it. This he could light at any moment, as he had in his possession a box of phosphorus matches. When it was quite dark, he got through the hole in the bulkhead, having taken the precaution to arrange the bedclothes in the berth so as to convey the idea of a person covered up. When through, he hung up the pea jacket on his knife as before to conceal the aperture, this maneuver being easily effected, as he did not readjust the piece of plank taken out afterward. He was now on the main orlop deck and proceeded to make his way as before between the upper deck and the oil casks to the main hatchway. Having reached this, he lit the piece of candle and descended, groping with extreme difficulty among the compact stowage of the hold. In a few moments he became alarmed at the insufferable stench and the closeness of the atmosphere. He could not think it possible that I had survived my confinement for so long a period, breathing so oppressive an air. He called my name repeatedly, but I made him no reply, and his apprehensions seemed thus to be confirmed. The brig was rolling violently, and there was so much noise in consequence that it was useless to listen for any weak sound, such as those of my breathing or snoring. He threw open the lantern and held it as high as possible whenever an opportunity occurred, in order that, by observing the light, I might, if alive, be aware that succor was approaching. Still nothing was heard from me, and the supposition of my death began to assume the character of certainty. He determined, nevertheless, to force a passage, if possible, to the box, and at least ascertain beyond a doubt of the truth of his surmises. He pushed on for some time in a most pitiable state of anxiety, until at length he found the pathway utterly blocked up, and that there was no possibility of making any farther way by the course in which he had set out. Overcome now by his feelings, he threw himself among the lumber in despair and wept like a child. It was at this period that he heard the crash occasioned by the bottle which I had thrown down. Fortunate indeed was it that the incident occurred, for upon this incident, trivial as it appears, the thread of my destiny depended. Many years elapsed, however, before I was aware of this fact. A natural shame and regret for his weakness and indecision prevented Augustus from confiding to me at once what a more intimate and unreserved communion afterward induced him to reveal. Upon finding his further progress in the hold impeded by obstacles which he could not overcome, he had resolved to abandon his attempt at reaching me and return at once to the forecastle. Before condemning him entirely on this head, the harassing circumstances which embarrassed him should be taken into consideration. The night was fast wearing away, and his absence from the forecastle might be discovered, and indeed would necessarily be so if he should fail to get back to the berth by daybreak. His candle was expiring in the socket, and there would be the greatest difficulty in retracing his way to the hatchway in the dark. It must be allowed, too, that he had every good reason to believe me dead, in which event no benefit could result to me from his reaching the box, and a world of danger would be encountered to no purpose by himself. He had repeatedly called, and I had made him no answer. I had been now 11 days and nights with no more water than that contained in the jug which he had left with me, a supply which it was not at all probable I had hoarded in the beginning of my confinement, as I had every cause to expect a speedy release. Good Lord. Speedy release. The atmosphere of the hold, too, must have appeared to him, coming from the comparatively open air of the steerage, of a nature absolutely poisonous, and by far more intolerable than it had seemed to me upon my first taking up my quarters in the box, the hatchway at that time having been constantly open for many months previous. Add to these considerations that the scene of bloodshed and terror so lately witnessed by my friend, his confinement, privations, and narrow escapes from death, together with the frail and equivocal tenure by which he still existed, circumstances all so well calculated to prostrate every energy of mind, and the reader will be easily brought, as I have been, to regard his apparent failing off in friendship and in faith with sentiments rather than sorrow and anger. Yes. Good call. The crash of the bottle was distinctly heard, yet Augustus was not sure that it proceeded from the hold. The doubt, however, was sufficient inducement to persevere. He clambered up nearly to the orlop deck by means of the stowage, and then, watching for a lull in the pitchings of the vessel, he called out to me in as loud a tone as he could command, regardless for the moment of being overheard by the crew. It will be remembered that on this occasion the voice reached me, but I was so entirely overcome by violent agitation as to be incapable of reply. Confident now that his worst apprehensions were well founded, he descended, with a view of getting back to the forecastle without loss of time. In his haste, some small boxes were thrown down, the noise occasioned by which I heard, as will be recollected. He had made considerable progress on his return when the fall of the knife again caused him to hesitate. He retraced his steps immediately, and clambering up the stowage a second time, called out my name, loudly as before, having watched for a lull. This time I found voice to answer. Overjoyed at discovering me still alive, he now resolved to brave every difficulty and danger in reaching me. Having extricated himself as quickly as possible from the labyrinth of lumber by which he was hemmed in, he at length struck into an opening which promised better, and finally, after a series of struggles, arrived at the box in a state of utter exhaustion. Good. Time to listen to a story while you're inside. Chapter 6. The leading particulars of this narration were all that Augustus communicated to me while we remained near the box. It was not until afterward that he entered fully in all the details. He was apprehensive of being missed, and I was wild with impatience to leave my detested place of confinement. We resolved to make our way at once to the hole in the bulkhead, near which I was to remain for the present, while he went through the reconnoitre. To leave Tiger in the box was what neither of us could endure to think of. Yet, how to act otherwise was the question. He now seemed to be perfectly quiet, and we could not even distinguish the sound of his breathing upon applying our ears closely to the box. I was convinced that he was dead, and determined to open the door. We found him lying at full length, apparently in a deep stupor, yet still alive. No time was to be lost. Yet I could not bring myself to abandon an animal who had now been twice instrumental in saving my life, without some attempt at preserving him. We therefore dragged him along with us as well as we could, although with the greatest difficulty and fatigue. Augustus, during part of the time, being forced to clamber over impediments in our way with the huge dog in his arms, a feat to which the feebleness of my frame rendered me totally inadequate. At length we succeeded in reaching the hole, when Augustus got through and Tiger was pushed in afterwards. All was found to be safe, and we did not fail to return sincere thanks to God for our deliverance from the imminent danger we had escaped. For the present, it was agreed that I should remain near the opening, through which my companion could readily supply me with a part of his daily provision, and where I could have the advantages of breathing an atmosphere comparatively pure. In explanation of some portions of this narrative, wherein I have spoken of the stowage of the brig, and which may appear ambiguous to some of my readers who may have seen a proper or regular stowage, I must here state that the manner in which this most important duty had been performed on board the Grampus was a most shameful piece of neglect on the part of Captain Barnard, who was by no means as careful or as experienced a seaman as the hazardous nature of the service on which he was employed would seem necessarily to demand. A proper stowage cannot be accomplished in a careless manner, and many most disastrous accidents, even within the limits of my own experience, have arisen from neglect or ignorance in this particular. Coasting vessels, and the frequent hurry and bustle attendant upon taking in or discharging cargo, are the most liable to mishap from the want of proper attention to stowage. The great point is to allow no possibility of the cargo or ballast shifting position, even in the most violent rollings of the vessel. With this end, great attention must be paid not only to the bulk taken in, but to the nature of the bulk and whether there be a full or only a partial cargo. In most kinds of freight, the stowage is accomplished by means of a screw. Thus, in a load of tobacco or flour, the whole is screwed so tightly into the hold of the vessel that the barrels or hogsheads, upon discharging, are found to be completely flattened, and take some time to regain their original shape. This screwing, however, is resorted to principally with a view of obtaining more room in the hold, for in a full load of any such commodities as flour or tobacco, there can be no danger of any shifting whatever, at least none from which inconvenience can result. There have been instances, indeed, where this method of screwing has resulted in the most lamentable consequences, arising from a cause altogether distinct from the danger attendant upon a shifting of cargo. A load of cotton, for example, tightly screwed in certain conditions, has been known, through the expansion of its bulk, to rend a vessel asunder at sea. There can be no doubt either that the same result would ensue in the case of tobacco, while undergoing its usual course of fermentation, were it not for the interstices consequent upon the rotundity of the hogsheads. It is when a partial cargo is received that danger is chiefly to be apprehended from shifting, and that precaution should always be taken to guard against such misfortune. Only those who have encountered a violent gale of wind, or rather who have experienced the rolling of a vessel in a sudden calm after the gale, can form an idea of the tremendous force of the plunges and of the consequent terrible impetus given to all loose articles in the vessel. It is then that the necessity of a cautious stowage, when there is a partial cargo, becomes obvious. When lying to, especially with a small headsail, a vessel which is not properly modelled in the bows is frequently thrown upon her beam ends, this occurring even every 15 or 20 minutes upon an average, yet without any serious consequences resulting, provided there be a proper stowage. If this, however, has not been strictly attended to, in the first of these heavy lurches, the whole of the cargo tumbles over to the side of the vessel which lies upon the water. And being thus prevented from regaining her equilibrium, as she would otherwise necessarily do, she is certain to fill in a few seconds and go down. It is not too much to say that at least one half of the instances in which vessels have foundered in heavy gales at sea may be attributed to a shifting of cargo or of ballast. That is difficult. It is an hour in. Shall I continue? We could read for a bit more. We're in Chapter 6. Oh, hey, Bucks. I didn't see you come in. I'm sorry. Hello. Hello and bye. Oops. My butterflies are caught on Grandma's spider. No shit. That's great. Where's my sweet? Where's my sugar? Yes, we will continue then. I'll give us just a few more minutes. I'm going to set up my second cup of coffee here from my lovely thermos. And see, this is what happened. I forgot. Like that's an especially good effect right there. Now that I've got my butterfly crown on, let me just bring down the spider. She can have a little snack right from me head. Hello, Tony. I'm just preparing a cup of coffee, and then we're going to continue. We're on Chapter 6. I'll give you a little tinkle as I stir while you get your snack ready for the continuation of Chapter 6. Let's test it. Ooh, that's just a bit much on the sugar. Yep, that's gonna do the job. Be bouncing off the walls. One more. And we'll have one little puff while I let you enjoy the intermission. Where'd my lighter go? I just had this. Like, I didn't even move. I did not even move. There it is. Dude. When a partial cargo of any kind is taken on board, the whole, after being first stowed as compactly as may be, should be covered with a layer of stout shifting boards extending completely across the vessel. Upon these boards, strong temporary stanchions should be erected, reaching to the timbers above, and thus securing everything in its place. In cargoes consisting of grain or any similar matter, additional precautions are requisite. A hold filled entirely with grain upon leaving port will be found no more than 3/4 full upon reaching its destination. This, too, although the freight, when measured bushel by the consignee, will overrun by a vast deal on account of the swelling of the grain, the quantity consigned. This result is occasioned by settling during the voyage, and is the more perceptible in proportion to the roughness of the weather experienced. If grain loosely thrown in a vessel, then, is ever so well secured by shifting boards and stanchions, it will be liable to shift in a long passage so greatly as to bring about the most distressing calamities. To prevent these, every method should be employed before leaving port to settle the cargo as much as possible, and for this there are many contrivances, among which may be mentioned the driving of wedges into the grain. Even after all this is done, and unusual pains taken to secure the shifting boards, no seaman who knows what he is about will feel altogether secure in a gale of any violence with a cargo of grain on board, and least of all with a partial cargo. Yet there are hundreds of our coasting vessels, and it is likely many more from the ports of Europe, which sail daily with partial cargoes, even of the most dangerous species, and without any precaution whatever. The wonder is that no more accidents occur than do actually happen. A lamentable instance of this heedlessness occurred to my knowledge in the case of Captain Joel Rice of the schooner Firefly, which sailed from Richmond, Virginia, to Madeira, with a cargo of corn in the year 1825. Pause. Mark the page in blue. And I will make note of names, probably connections. Firefly comes up all the time. The captain had gone many voyages without serious accident, although he was in the habit of paying no attention whatever to his stowage, more than to secure it in the ordinary manner. He had never before sailed with a cargo of grain, and on this occasion had the corn thrown on board loosely, when it did not much more than fill half the vessel. For the first portion of the voyage he met with nothing more than light breezes, but when within a day's sail of Madeira, there came on a strong gale from the north-northeast, which forced him to lie to. He brought the schooner to the wind under a double-reefed foresail alone, when she rode as well as any vessel could be expected to do, and shipped not a drop of water. Toward night the gale somewhat abated, and she rolled with more unsteadiness than before, but still did very well, until a heavy lurch threw her upon her beam's ends to starboard. The corn was then heard to shift bodily, the force of the movement bursting open the main hatchway. The vessel went down like a shot. This happened within hail of a small sloop from Madeira, which picked up one of the crew, the only person saved, and which rode out the gale in perfect security, as indeed a jolly boat might have done under proper management. That's right. Yeah, Firefly. Man, that's a whole TV series that's all about some crazy stuff. Look it up, watch it. Firefly. And that's written by another guy who's like, his literature, and which was turned into a lot of television series, is all over the place. Joss Whedon. Oh my God, if that dude ain't dropping some stuff on y'all. He do. The work of Joss Whedon. Okay. The stowage on board the Grampus was most clumsily done, if stowage that could be called, which was little better than promiscuous huddling together of oil casks and ship furniture. I have already spoken of the condition of the articles in the hold. On the orlop deck there was space enough for my body, as I have stated, between the oil casks and the upper deck. A space was left open around the main hatchway, and several other large spaces were left in the stowage. Near the hole cut through the bulkhead by Augustus, there was room enough for an entire cask, and in this space I found myself comfortably situated for the present. By the time my friend had got safely into the berth and readjusted his handcuffs and the rope, it was broad daylight. We had made a narrow escape indeed, for scarcely had he arranged all matters when the mate came below with Dirk Peters and the cook. They talked for some time about the vessel from Cape Verds, and seemed to be excessively anxious for her appearance. At length the cook came to the berth in which Augustus was lying, and seated himself in it near the head. I could see and hear everything from my hiding place, for the piece cut out had not been put back, and I was in momentary expectation that the negro would fall against the pea jacket, which was hung up to conceal the aperture, in which case all would have been discovered, and our lives would, no doubt, have been instantly sacrificed. Our good fortune prevailed, however, and although he frequently touched it as the vessel rolled, he never pressed against it sufficiently to bring about a discovery. The bottom of the jacket had been carefully fastened to the bulkhead, so that the hole might not be seen by its swinging to one side. All this time, Tiger was lying in the foot of the berth, and appeared to have recovered in some measure his faculties, for I could see him occasionally open his eyes and draw a long breath. After a few minutes, the mate and cook went above, leaving Dirk Peters behind, who, as soon as they were gone, came and sat himself down in the place just occupied by the mate. He began to talk very sociably with Augustus, and we would now see that the greater part of his apparent intoxication, while the two others were with him, was a feint. He answered all my companions' questions with perfect freedom, told him that he had no doubt of his father's having been picked up, as there was no less than 5 sail in sight just before sundown on the day he was cut adrift, and used other language of a consolatory nature, which occasioned me no less surprise than pleasure. Indeed, I began to entertain hopes that through the instrumentality of Peters, we might be finally enabled to regain possession of the brig, and this idea I mentioned to Augustus as soon as I found an opportunity. There's a note on the last page. Let me turn back and read it. 1 footnote. Whaling vessels are usually fitted with iron oil tanks. Why the Grampus was not, I have never been able to ascertain. So perhaps there was sabotage beforehand, is what I'm reading from these accounts, and according to those types of notes. Sabotage in advance. Which sounds like another parallel of what's going on here. Saboteurs. He thought the matter possible, but urged the necessity of the greatest caution in making the attempt, as the conduct of the hybrid appeared to be instigated by the most arbitrary caprice alone, and indeed it was difficult to say if he was at any moment of sound mind. Peters went upon deck in about an hour and did not return again until noon, when he brought Augustus a plentiful supply of junk beef and pudding. Everybody likes pudding. Of this, when we were left alone, I partook heartily, without returning through the hole. No one else came down into the forecastle during the day, and at night I got into Augustus's berth, where I slept soundly and sweetly until nearly daybreak, when he awakened me upon hearing a stir upon deck, and I regained my hiding place as quickly as possible. When the day was finally broke, we found that Tiger had recovered his strength almost entirely and gave no indications of hydrophobia, drinking a little water that was offered him with great apparent eagerness. During the day he regained all his former vigor and appetite. His strange conduct had been brought on, no doubt, by the deleterious quality of the air of the hold, and had no connection with canine madness. I could not sufficiently rejoice that I had persisted in bringing him with me from the box. This day was the 30th of June, and the 30th since the Grampus made sail from Nantucket. On the 2nd of July, the mate came below, drunk as usual and in an excessively good humor. He came to Augustus's berth, and giving him a slap on the back, asked him if he thought he could behave himself if he let him loose, and whether he would promise not to be going into the cabin again. To this, of course, my friend answered in the affirmative, when the ruffian set him at liberty, after making him drink from a flask of rum which he drew from his coat pocket. Both now went on deck, and I did not see Augustus for about 3 hours. He then came below with the good news that he had obtained permission to go about the brig as he pleased anywhere forward of the main mast, and that he had been ordered to sleep, as usual, in the forecastle. He brought me, too, a good dinner and a plentiful supply of water. The brig was still cruising for the vessel from the Cape Verde, and events of the ensuing 8 days were of little importance, and had no direct bearing upon the main incidents of my narrative. I will here throw them into the form of a journal, as I do not wish to omit them altogether. Okay, so this part might be a little dry. Let's give it a moment here. July 3rd. Augustus furnished me with 3 blankets with which I contrived a comfortable bed in my hiding place. No one came below except my companion during the day. Tiger took his station in the berth just by the aperture and slept heavily, as if not yet entirely recovered from the effects of his sickness. Toward night, a flaw of wind struck the bridge before sail could be taken in, and very nearly capsized her. The puff died away immediately, however, and no damage was done beyond the splitting of the foretopsail. Dirk Peters treated Augustus all this day with great kindness and entered into a long conversation with him respecting the Pacific Ocean and the islands he had visited in that region. He asked him whether he would not like to go with the mutineers on a kind of exploring and pleasure voyage in those quarters, and said that the men were gradually coming over to the mate's views. To this, Augustus thought it best to reply that he would be glad to go on such an adventure, since nothing better could be done, and that anything was preferable to a piratical life. Pirate life. July 4th. The vessel in sight proved to be a small brig from Liverpool and was allowed to pass unmolested. Augustus spent most of his time on deck, with a view of obtaining all the information in his power respecting the intentions of the mutineers. They had frequent and violent quarrels among themselves, in one of which was a harpooner, Jim Bonner, was thrown overboard. The party of the mate was gaining ground. Jim Bonner belonged to the cook's gang, of which Peters was a partisan. July 5th. About daybreak there came on a stiff breeze from the west, which at noon freshened into a gale, so that the brig could carry nothing more than her trysail and foresail. In partaking of the foretopsail, Sims, one of the common hands, and belonging also to the cook's gang, fell overboard, being very much in liquor, and was drowned, no attempt being made to save him. The whole number of persons on board was now 13, to wit, Dirk Peters, Seymour, the black cook, Jones, Greeley, Hartman Rogers, and William Allan of the cook's party, the mate, whose name I never learned, Absalom Hicks, something Wilson, John Hunt, and Richard Parker of the mate's party, besides Augustus and myself. It really does just say blank, blank, blank Wilson. So it's only given a last name. July 6th. The gale lasted all day, blowing in heavy squalls accompanied with rain. The brig took on a good deal of water through her seams, and one of the pumps was kept continuously going, Augustus being forced to take his turn. Just at twilight, a large ship passed close by us without having been discovered until within hail. The ship was supposed to be the one for which the mutineers were on the lookout. The mate hailed her, but the reply was drowned in the roaring of the gale. At 11, a sea was shipped amidships, which tore away a great portion of the larboard bulwarks and did some other slight damage. Toward morning, the weather moderated, and at sunrise there was very little wind. July 7th. There was a heavy swell running all this day, during which the brig, being light, rolled excessively, and many articles broke loose in the hold, as I could hear distinctly from my hiding place. I suffered a great deal from seasickness. Peters had a long conversation this day with Augustus, and told him that 2 of his gang, Greeley and Allan, had gone over to the mate, and were resolved to turn pirates. He put several questions to Augustus, which he did not then exactly understand. During a part of this evening the leak gained upon the vessel, and little could be done to remedy it, as it was occasioned by the brig's straining and taking in the water through her seams. A sail was thrummed and got under the bows, which aided us in some measure, so that we began to gain upon the leak. July 8th. A light breeze sprang up at sunrise from the eastward when the mate headed the brig to the southwest, with the intention of making some of the West India Islands, in pursuance of his piratical designs. No opposition was made by Peters or the cook, at least none in the hearing of Augustus. All idea of taking the vessel from the Cape Verds was abandoned. The leak was now easily kept under by one pump going every 3/4 of an hour. The sail was drawn from beneath the bows. Spoke 2 small schooners during the day. July 9th, fine weather. All hands employed in repairing bulwarks. Peters had again a long conversation with Augustus and spoke more plainly than he had done heretofore. He said nothing should induce him to come into the mate's views, and even hinted his intention of taking the brig out of his hands. He asked my friend if he could depend on his aid in such case, to which Augustus said yes, without hesitation. Peters then said he would sound the others of his party upon the subject, and went away. During the remainder of the day, Augustus had no opportunity of speaking with him privately. I keep having trouble saying the name Augustus, and it sucks that it's in here a million times. Chapter 7. July 10th. Spoke a brig from Rio, bound to Norfolk. Weather hazy, with a light baffling wind from the eastward. Today, Hartman Rogers died, having been attacked on the 8th with spasms after drinking a glass of grog. This man was of the cook's party, and one upon whom Peters placed his main reliance. He told Augustus that he believed the mate had poisoned him, and that he expected, if he did not be on the lookout, his own turn would come shortly. Murder most foul above board the Grampus, or something, I don't know. There were now only himself, Jones, and the cook belonging to his own gang. On the other side, there were 5. He had spoken to Jones about taking the command from the mate, but the project having been coolly received, he had been deterred from pressing the matter any further, or from saying anything to the cook. It was well, as it happened, that he was so prudent, for in the afternoon the cook expressed his determination of siding with the mate, and went over formally to that party, while Jones took an opportunity of quarreling with Peters, and hinted that he would let the mate know of the plan in agitation. There was now evidently no time to be lost, and Peters expressed his determination of attempting to take the vessel at all hazards, provided Augustus would lend him his aid. My friend at once assured him of his willingness to enter into any plan for that purpose, and thinking the opportunity a favorable one, made known the fact of my being on board. At this the hybrid was not more astonished than delighted, as he had no reliance whatever upon Jones, whom he already considered as belonging to the party of the mate. They went below immediately, when Augustus called to me by name, and Peters and myself were soon made acquainted. It was agreed that we should attempt to retake the vessel upon the first good opportunity, leaving Jones altogether out of our counsels. In the event of success, we were to run the brig into the first port that offered, and deliver her up. The desertion of the party had frustrated Peters' design of going into the Pacific, an adventure which could not be accomplished without a crew, and he depended either getting acquitted upon trial on the score of insanity, which he solemnly averred had actuated him in lending his aid to the mutiny, or upon obtaining a pardon, if found guilty, through the representations of Augustus and myself. Our deliberations were interrupted for the present by the cry of, "All hands take in sail!" and Peters and Augustus ran up on deck. As usual, the crew were nearly all drunk, and before sail could be properly taken in, a violent squall laid the brig on her boom ends. By keeping her away, however, she righted, having shipped a good deal of water. Scarcely was everything secure when another squall took the vessel, and immediately afterward another, no damage being done. There was every appearance of a gale wind, which indeed shortly came on with great fury from the northward and westward. All was made as snug as possible, and we laid to, as usual, under a close reefed foresail. As night drew on, the wind increased in violence, with a remarkably heavy sea. Peters now came into the forecastle with Augustus, and we resumed our deliberations. We agreed that no opportunity could be more favorable than the present for carrying our design into effect, as an attempt at such a moment would never be anticipated. As the brig was snugly laid to, there would be no necessity of maneuvering her until good weather, when, if we succeeded in our attempt, we might liberate one, or perhaps two of the men to aid us in taking her into port. The main difficulty was the great disproportion in our forces. There were only 3 of us, and in the cabin there were 9. All the arms on board, too, were in their possession, with the exception of a pair of small pistols which Peters had concealed about his person, and the large seaman's knife which he always wore in the waistband of his pantaloons. From certain indications, too, such for example as there being no such thing as an axe or a handspike lying in their customary places, we began to fear that the mate had his suspicions, at least in regard to Peters, and that he would let slip no opportunity of getting rid of him. It was clear, indeed, that what we should determine to do could not be done too soon. Still, the odds were too much against us to allow of our proceeding without the greatest caution. Peters proposed that he should go up on deck and enter into conversation with the watch, Allan, when he would be able to throw him into the sea without trouble, and without making any disturbance, by seizing a good opportunity. That Augustus and myself should then come up and endeavor to provide ourselves with some kind of weapons from the deck, and that we should then make a rush together and secure the companionway before any opposition could be offered. I objected to this because I could not believe that the mate, who was a cunning fellow in all matters which did not affect his superstitious prejudices, would suffer himself to be so easily entrapped. The very fact of there being a watch on deck at all was sufficient proof that he was upon the alert, it not being usual, except in vessels where discipline is most rigidly enforced, to station a watch on deck when a vessel is lying to in a gale of wind. As I address myself principally, if not altogether, to persons who have never been to sea, it may be as well to state the exact condition of a vessel under such circumstances. Lying to, or in sea parlance, laying to, is a measure resorted to for various purposes, and effected in various manners. In moderate weather, it is frequently done with a view of merely bringing the vessel to a standstill to wait for another vessel or any similar object. If the vessel which lies to is under full sail, the maneuver is usually accomplished by throwing round some portion of her sails, so as to let the wind take them aback when she becomes stationary. But we are now speaking of lying to in a gale of wind. This is done when the wind is ahead, and too violent to admit of carrying sail without danger of capsizing, and sometimes even when the wind is fair, but the sea too heavy for the vessel to be put before it. If a vessel be suffered to scud before the wind in a very heavy sea, much damage is usually done her by the shipping of water over her stern, and sometimes by the violent plunges she makes forward. This maneuver, then, is seldom resorted to in such case, unless through necessity. When the vessel is in a leaky condition, she is often put before the wind even in the heaviest seas, for, when lying to, her seams are sure to be greatly opened by her violent straining, and it is not so much the case when scudding. Often, too, it becomes necessary to scud a vessel either when the blast is so exceedingly furious as to tear in pieces the sail which is employed with a view of bringing her head to the wind, or when, through the false modeling of the frame or other causes, this main object cannot be effected. That was technical. Vessels in a gale of wind are laid to in different manners according to their peculiar construction. Some lie to best under a foresail, and this, I believe, is the sail most usually employed. Large square-rigged vessels have sails for the express purpose called storm stay sails. Storm stay sails. But the jib is occasionally employed by itself. Sometimes the jib and foresail or a double-reefed foresail, and not unfrequently the aftersails, are made use of. Foretop sails are very often found to answer the purpose better than any other species of sail. The grampus was generally laid to under a close reefed foresail. When a vessel is being laid to, her head is brought up to the wind just so nearly as to fill the sail under which she lies when hauled flat aft, that is, when brought diagonally across the vessel. This being done, the bows point within a few degrees of the direction from which the wind issues, and the windward bow, of course, receives the shock of the waves. In this situation, a good vessel will ride out a very heavy gale of wind without shipping a drop of water, and without any further attention being requisite on the part of the crew. The helm is usually lashed down, but this is altogether unnecessary, except on account of the noise it makes when loose, for the rudder has no effect upon the vessel when lying to. Indeed, the helm had far better be left loose than lashed very fast, for the rudder is apt to be torn off by heavy seas if there be no room for the helm to play. As long as the sail holds, a well-modeled vessel will maintain her situation and ride every sea as if instinct with life and reason. If the violence of the wind, however, should tear the sail into pieces, a feat which it requires a perfect hurricane to accomplish under ordinary circumstances, there is then imminent danger. The vessel falls off from the wind and, coming broadside to the sea, is completely at its mercy. The only recourse in this case is to put her quietly before the wind, letting her scud until some other sail can be set. Some vessels will lie to under no sail whatever, but such are not to be trusted at sea. But to return from this digression, it had never been customary with the mate to have any watch on deck when lying to in a gale of wind, and the fact that he had one now, coupled with the circumstance of the missing axes and handspikes, fully convinced us that the crew were too well on the watch to be taken by surprise in the manner Peters had suggested. Something, however, was to be done, and that was as little delay as practicable, for there could be no doubt that a suspicion having been once entertained against Peters, he would be sacrificed upon the earliest occasion, and one would certainly be either found or made upon the breaking of the gale. Augustus now suggested that if Peters could contrive to remove under any pretext the piece of chain cable which lay over the trap in the stateroom, we might possibly be able to come upon them unawares by means of the hold. But a little reflection convinced us that the vessel rolled and pitched too violently for any attempt of that nature. By good fortune, I at length hit upon the idea of working upon the superstitious terrors and guilty conscience of the mate. It will be remembered that one of the crew, Hartman Rogers, had died during the morning, having been attacked 2 days before with spasms after drinking some spirits and water. Peters had expressed to us his opinion that this man had been poisoned by the mate, and for this belief he had reasons, so he said, which were incontrovertible, but which he could not be prevailed upon to explain to us, this wayward refusal being only in keeping with other points of his singular character. But whether or not he had any better grounds for suspecting the mate than we had ourselves, we were easily led to fall in with his suspicion and determined to act accordingly. Rogers had died about 11 in the forenoon, in violent convulsions, and the corpse presented in a few minutes after death one of the most horrid and loathsome spectacles I ever remembered to have seen. The stench was swollen immensely, like that. Oh, I'm sorry. The stomach was swollen immensely, like that of a man who has been drowned and lain under water for many weeks. The hands were in the same condition, while the face was shrunken, shriveled, and of a chalky whiteness, except where relieved by 2 or 3 glaring red blotches, like those occasioned by the erysipelas. I don't know this word. One of these blotches extended diagonally across the face, completely covering up an eye as if with a band of red velvet. In this disgusting condition, the body had been brought up from the cabin at noon to be thrown overboard, when the mate, getting a glimpse of it, for he now saw it for the first time, and being either touched with remorse for his crime or struck with terror at so terrible a sight, ordered the men to sew the body up in its hammock and allow it the usual rites of sea burial. Having given these directions, he went below as if to avoid any further sight of his victim. While preparations were making to obey his orders, the gale came on with great fury, and the design was abandoned for the present. The corpse, left to itself, was washed into the larboard scuppers, where it still lay at the time of which I speak, floundering about with the furious lurches of the brig. This is good music in the background. Today we've got down tempo. It's one of the ones that comes right in Restream. We're almost at the very end, so let's finish. The end of this chapter anyway. Having arranged our plan, we set about putting it into execution as speedily as possible. Peters went upon deck, and as he had anticipated, was immediately accosted by Allan, who appeared to be stationed more as a watch upon the forecastle than for any other purpose. The fate of this villain, however, was speedily and silently decided, for Peters, approaching him in a careless manner, as if about to address him, seized him by the throat, and before he could utter a single cry, tossed him over the bulwarks. He then called to us, and we came up. Our first precaution was to look about for something with which to arm ourselves, and in doing this we had to proceed with great care, for it was impossible to stand on deck an instant without holding fast, and violent sea broke over the vessel at every plunge forward. It was indispensable, too, that we should be quick in our operations, for every minute we expected the mate to be up to set the pumps going, as it was evident the brig must be taking in water very fast. After searching about for some time, we could find nothing more fit for our purpose than the 2 pump handles, one of which Augustus took, and I the other. Having secured these, we stripped off the shirt of the corpse and dropped the body overboard. Peters and myself then went below, leaving Augustus to watch upon deck, where he took his station just where Allan had been placed, and with his back to the cabin companionway, so that if any of the mate's gang should come up, he might suppose it was the watch. As soon as I got below, I commenced disguising myself so as to represent the corpse of Rogers. The shirt which we had taken from the body aided us very much, for it was of singular form and character, and easily recognizable, a kind of smock which the deceased wore over his other clothing. It was a blue stockinette with large white stripes running across. Having put this on, I proceeded to equip myself with a false stomach in imitation of the horrible deformity of the swollen corpse. This was soon effected by means of stuffing with some bedclothes. I then gave the same appearance to my hands by drawing on a pair of white woolen mittens and filling them in with any kind of rags that offered themselves. Peters then arranged my face, first rubbing it well over with white chalk, then afterward blotching it with blood which he took from the cut on his finger. The streak across the eye was not forgotten and presented a most shocking appearance. I think I'm going to call it done for today. That was an hour and a half. That's a very good amount of time. So I'm going to mark my page. And I don't know. I just feel antsy. I gotta get out of here. That's the end of chapter 7. So when we resume reading on the morrow or the day after, we'll begin with chapter 8. To any who are still now watching, thank you for tuning in. This was a bit of a boring one. There's some interesting names, numbers. I don't know if they'll add up to anything, but I will look at them. Maybe. I think I mentioned that I was going to go over the little bit that I found about the name Pym and its origins. So just while I'm sitting here, I'll go ahead and do that now. And I had it bookmarked. Let's see if I can bring it up. Where is it? Okay. Urban Dictionary. Pym. I'll just read it rather than share the page. This is from urbandictionary.com. I really didn't find much else about it other than what I mentioned of Prepare Your Mind by the family of Robin Williams. The surname, and it gives several different spellings. The name itself is of medieval English Anglo-Saxon origin. It derives from the medieval female given name Pym, Pima, from Femi, which is a shortened nickname or pet form of Euphemia, a Greek name introduced into Europe by the returning crusaders of the 11th century. The surname Pym referred to the son of Euphemia, which belongs to the category of patronymic surnames. Composed of the elements EU, meaning well, and Pheni, meaning to speak. The name was adopted by Christians who used it in the sense of praise God or good repute, well spoken of, or to speak well of. This Greek word is found in Philippians 4:8. And that's about it. Let's see, anything else? To pym, or to be pimmed, the act of forcing a Scotch egg or alternative globe-shaped buffet treat into one's mouth whilst masturbating and watching the television phenomenon that is Glee. I'm sorry, that's an entry on Urban Dictionary. I just now ran across it, so I thought I'd share it because that's funny. So, enjoy that little morsel if you made it all the way to the end. There's always something. I do love Scotch eggs. I haven't had one in so long. They serve them at the Michigan Renaissance Festival, but I don't eat that kind of meat anymore, and I haven't in years. So I'm not going to get to have a Scotch egg. I missed the Renaissance Festival this year anyway. So I hope you all are enjoying your day. I don't even know what day of the week it is, so we're not going to give it one. I will only say thank you for tuning in. Tony's Coffee House, forever love. The Bex Factor, Just JP, Lord Racer. We also had at some point in here, there's my forever love, Mr. Voy, Terry King, and 007. Did we have David? I think David was here near the beginning and dropped a wave. Don't remember. But I'll scroll through and see. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody. If I did, it's not on purpose. I love you. I'm really bad at this, that's all. So I'll see you later. Much love. Have beautiful